Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 604. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. The SPaMCAST 604 features a presentation that I did on the need for organizations to lean into process improvement as the COVID-19 disaster abates, at least for the time being. I did this presentation for the International Function Point User Group's Knowledge Cafe in early June. Remember, continuous improvement can't be just a slogan during any economic slowdown. We also have a visit from Jon M Quigley with his Alpha and Omega product development column. Jon and I talked about the definition of quality and whether the concept of quality is a matter of perception. We didn't exactly see eye to eye. What are your thoughts? As Christine said, feel free to type in questions into the chat or to holler in the chat at somebody, and they'll try to flag me down, and we'll answer questions as we go. Software development organizations preparing for life after COVID-19. As I think we've noticed, this is a big impact. My 4-year-old granddaughter, if nothing else, right? Even people who are not in the workplace are going to have memories of this. This is a big event across the world. My 4-year-old granddaughter already talks about the time when her mother sat at the kitchen table and made masks and then drove and threw them on people's porches because she couldn't actually interact with them. But her problem was, the 4-year-old, was that she couldn't go on swings anymore. She couldn't go to playgrounds, and swings are a big deal with her. So many of us, just something happened, whether you're in India or here in the States or somewhere else, suddenly we went from having, distributed teams perhaps rarely or clumps of distributed teams to everybody was distributed, remote working. Zoom is our favorite friend these days. Those ripples, I think, will continue for a long period of time. This has been really fast, and I picked up this map from the WHO a few days ago, and it's already significantly out of date, right? Part of the reason that we feel this so acutely is the speed. But this isn't our first rodeo with epidemics and pandemics. I spent last weekend in Maryland because we could travel a little bit, and I went to visit my eldest daughter, who has multiple degrees in international medical affairs. And this is her 4th epidemic and pandemic that she's been involved with. She did work in Haiti during the cholera outbreak. She's worked in East Africa on polio. She's done work on HIV/AIDS here in the States, and now has been impacted by COVID-19. If we go back in time, the idea of COVID-19 being the first real pandemic that we're aware of, you go back to 541 AD, the plague of Justinian, which is the worst plague that man has records on. 100 million deaths in 541 AD, 541, 542. Obviously things are different, right? We've made medical advances, our world is interconnected, we've got a lot of technology, but we're still going to have an impact. So just a little bit more context, right? I think our technology really has softened the impact of social distancing and living in our houses versus going out. I was telling Sarah before we went on the air, I haven't been to a grocery store. We haven't gone to the grocery store in 5 weeks. And we're not having stuff delivered. We're going to have to make a run today. I'm out of beer. And as Ian Brown will tell you, life is beer. Distributed teams have become the absolute norm, right? That is, as software folks, what's normal now. And this whole idea that we'll wave a magic wand, something will happen, and we'll all go back to work and physically go back to where we were is just crazy. I have lots of friends that I talk to, lots of large companies who have zero interest in going back to the office until next year. People aren't going back. We're going to be spread out for a long time, and we've gotten to the point where we're pretty good at dealing with that kind of stuff, right? That's good, but at the same time, our leaders, the executives and organizations, are getting all sorts of wonderful advice on what they need to do to keep their business afloat. And I'm not going to say that that's a wrong thing, but I read a great article from PwC. I'll throw that in the show notes later on, and you can get the URL for it. But 3 of the items that jumped out at me instantaneously were: you need to assess your workforce costs. You need to identify alternate supply chain scenarios. You need to assess the impact of all of this on your cash position. Well, I'm sorry, that screams expense management and bottom line, focus on the bottom line. Things like outsourcing, which was to extend capability, now is going to come back in force in terms of being focused on expense management. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm real neutral on outsourcing. I work for outsourcers. I've done work for outsourcers. I have done work for organizations trying to outsource. Yeah, so I have no qualms whatsoever, assuming it's done for the right reason and core stuff isn't being outsourced. But the reality is, if you look back at the previous shocks to the economy, the financial crisis was the most recent one that many of us remember, we see this focus on the bottom line and on the value chain. So our executives, they focus on 2 basic things. 2 things are important to them, right? Revenue and the bottom line. Because let's face it, if they don't control all of that stuff, if they don't focus on it, then very frankly, the organization will it'll cease to exist in some cases. So all of that's important. Our rule, right, and if we're going to talk about how we help with coming out of this, we need to be able to understand where work flows through the value chain and what those things are that aren't on the value chain. And there's a lot of things within. So I'm a big fan of Michael Porter's view of value chain. So highly suggest understanding that. But let's face it, the transformation of ideas into code that end up in being shipped, if you're a software manufacturer, that's the value chain. If you're transforming ideas into code that's there to support, that isn't the value chain. That's there to support. We have to understand where we fall on that. So all of that, I think, are critical pieces and things that are important to understand, because they will give us an understanding of how we can improve things like the bottom line. But so what is next? And if we go back to the future, and many of us can remember things: do more with less, work faster, work better, work cheaper. Those sort of crazy mantras from, most of those are from the 1980s or 1990s. Those bumper sticker mantras still make my skin crawl, right? Because what they did was they focused on the wrong thing. And most people weren't doing things like assessments or benchmarks, or weren't looking at the numbers, so that high-performing teams got disrupted. We weren't focused on the wrong thing. I think we have to resist the sort of the siren call of all of this. And those that did find a different path found that the whole idea of benchmarking and continuous improvement really were the way to go in terms of making sure that they had the capability and capacity to do work, both of those being different. So our friend Peter Drucker, and I think most of these kind of presentations aren't complete unless we throw in an idea from Deming or Drucker And we'll get to Deming later. He's a hero of mine. But Drucker said that there is nothing so useless as doing efficiently what should not be done at all. Our understanding of the value chain, I think, will help us get to that. So, are there questions?
From Christine, why did it work smarter?
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were sharing the previous slide where you got work faster, stuff like that, why we didn't talk about working smarter.
Well, I to be honest with you, I think most organizations, again, these are bumper stickers. I always like to ask if you have people that are stupid in your organization, please show them to me, because those are the easy low-hanging fruit. Most people are working their process and the constraints and the culture define what they can and can't do. I don't think people are not working smarter. So I think, again, that's one of those throwaway things that we say to people: work smarter, work faster, work better. Those sorts of things, that's just rah-rah stuff. Unless we allow people, teams, value chains, release trains, those sorts of things, to actually manage and self-organize, then all of those things are just words. Rolling forward a little bit, the whole idea, right, of benchmarking and then continuously improving, I think are critical to organizations and people surviving for the next few years as the bottom line drives constraints in organizations in terms of how much expense is going to be allowed and where you're going to spend it and whether or not it's going to sit on the balance sheet or it's just purely an expense. So if you don't have an answer, if you can't as a team or a value chain or a different size group, if you can't answer the question, how effective are you? How efficient? If you can't answer those things, why should anybody spend money on you? Why should any executive not just say, well, I think it's time to push this somewhere else, right? So I think you have to start with the idea of finding out where you are, a benchmark, and then begin improving. But all of that is then premised on then continuing to have some mechanism of a feedback loop to know whether or not your experiments are working. Yes, Yushmita.
There is a question, but how can we benchmark disruptive technologies?
It's an excellent question. So if you can't find something to compare it to, you draw the line in the sand for yourself, right? You create yourself a baseline and then benchmark yourself. Most disruptive technologies aren't quite as disruptive as people think they are. And perhaps if we were talking about high-end AI, not just machine learning and those sorts of things have been around since the 1980s. At one point when I worked for KeyBank, actually back in the late 80s, early 90s, before I went to work for SPR, we had put together expert systems that were self-learning. And so the idea that just has sprung into existence now, I would suggest is not necessarily true. So always challenge your suggestion that everything's disruptive can't be compared to something else. Where there are things that can't be compared, create your baseline and then compare yourself to that. Start using that to show that you are improving. And I think that's as good as you can get in that position. So I hope that helps. I live most of my professional life these days in the agile world. And hardcore Scrum, less DSDM on occasion, safe, even though some people might not consider that agile. But a lot of the constructs of Agile are built on the idea that they will take an empiricism or an empirical point of view, right? That they'll use their senses to know whether or not something's good or bad. I'm a firm belief that one has to use your sight and your senses, inspect and adapt. That's a great, again, bumper sticker, but it's a great understanding that we will look and we will adapt to that. The problem is that without hardcore theory, rationalism behind it, none of this stuff works. And I think we then get trapped into it. So the first of a couple of Deming references, for those of you who have never either seen this or looked at it, I would suggest you go look at the Deming's funnel experiment, where you react. You're inspecting and adapting, but you're reacting to every drop through the funnel. And what you find is that Deming calls that tampering, because all of that is common cause variation, that you have to understand the difference between common and special cause variation. Again, we go back to a rationalized or rationalism point of view. Add both. Both are required to empower teams to actually self-manage. If we combine an approach that says we're going to inspect and adapt, we're going to go look at what's happening and think about that, and at the same time we're going to use mathematical and logical understanding about what should happen, theory, then we can come up with an assessment framework. And whether it's capability maturity or any of the others, what we're doing is we're using both sides of the equation. We're looking at the quantitative side. And I'll be honest with you, there are only 4 things from a measurement point of view that I think are worthy of a high-level macro view. And to start with, throughput, speed, cycle timing kinds of stuff, cost effectiveness, which takes us into the category of size measures. I probably have somewhere tattooed on me IFPUG function points, or at least mentally I do. But that's really an efficiency view of the world, a cost effectiveness. How are we leveraging our fiduciary responsibility to use money and in the best financial way? It's effectiveness. And then quality. Those 4 things can tell a huge story. We can then dive down and say, well, how did that happen? The qualitative side. Because the qualitative side, sense and adapt, we can apply theories to. In the late 90s, we applied things like the CMMI because we thought that there were things called best practices, which we then later found out are just good practices. We can apply frameworks like Kanban or Scrum and say, how is this supposed to work? And then determine, based on what we've measured, whether or not that's effective, whether or not we then can compare it to other things. It's where things like ice bags and other sources of data, I won't say truth, but other sources of data allow us to take and get an understanding of how we're performing. Again, what's our goal? Our goal is to know what we did and then how we did it and marry the two together so that we can turn around and say, what are the opportunities to actually get better? What are the opportunities to have a conversation to say, look, hey, you all love us. We're making our clients happy. That's great. But if we're not efficient, then we have a different thing. Because the executives, again, goes back to what are the 2 things that they really care about? Impact to the top line, revenue, impact to the bottom line, which is generally expenses, maintaining that. So just being good and just making people happy, unless that translates, doesn't matter a lot in the long run. Short run, probably. That gets me in trouble with some of my agile friends. But in reality, this isn't about trying to paint a dismal picture. We want to be able to have an understanding of what works, what's the context of what works, so that we can facilitate change, facilitate safe to fail experiments, because we know what the constructs and what the boundaries are in those circumstances. So if we cycle back to our friends empiricism and rationalism just for a second, regardless of the measures that you use or want to use, I'm a big fan of the four that at least those categories that I told you about. But I work with testing groups these days, and some of them are trying to measure code coverage and things like that. I'm not 100% sure always what value that drives, and there's always a good conversation about that, because it can facilitate some interesting behavior. As we all know as measurement folks, what you measure sometimes is what you get. Sometimes what you measure causes behavior changes. All of those things are true, and you need to stay focused on what those are and how they affect others. But again, going back to this empiricism and rationalism piece, we need to understand what those measures contribute and where they contribute and how that works, right? We're going to go look, but we have to understand the theory of why that happens. So, for example, if you decide to measure productivity, I think you guys have heard of productivity before. Something I think that most of us that have been in this business for more than a few days have heard. And again, lots of different kinds of productivity, but generally what we're talking about is labor productivity, right? How much stuff gets created per unit of work. We could throw in throughput to understand the speed of that kind of thing. We need to ensure that we're observing the processes that are affected by those measures also. So not only think of them as a black box, but as we create them or as they're used, they come out the other side. And when they come out the other side, well, they're consumed, hopefully, by something, because if you're measuring it and nobody's consuming that, I would strongly suggest you find a shredder and stop doing that. Your time is more valuable than that. But, if we think about that data life cycle, we often only take and look at it at a point in time, after it, after the event that has caused it happened. But it then lives forward. We need to look at how it's consumed, because those are also improvement opportunities or potential improvement opportunities. So if we pick on productivity, where does that get used? Well, obviously, somebody's probably going to report it. Somebody's probably end up going to talk about it in a meeting, whether or not they tell the right story. Once upon a lifetime ago, there was an organization that called their measurement report that came out every week the fire drill report. And there were positives and negatives to that fire drill. But in essence, every manager then had to run out and create a story about why their numbers were what they were. The report on the report was then called the feeble excuse report. So again, think about not only collecting the data, but how it's consumed and the follow-on consequences of that. There was a lot that was fixable in that scenario because people were doing the wrong thing. They were consuming it incorrectly. Data was right, the reaction was wrong, kind of thing. I was going to say, as an agilist, I'd like to say this out loud, but arguably this is true regardless of the framework that you think about and regardless of the approach that you take. All measures, and we need to focus on the work that impacts the product backlog. How does it get there? How long does it stay? Because it flows through the value chain. We need to think about what happens between start and done. And I like using the term done, because done in an agile sense means that it is shippable. And arguably, right, if it isn't shippable, it isn't done. So if we're looking at a piece of work and we're measuring things like cycle time, and we've got coders over here and testers over here and DevOps folks over here and somebody else over here, and we're counting things as done multiple times along the way, I think we're obscuring what the flow of work is. And again, I don't think any of us who've been at this for any length of time would recognize that and say that's a great idea, but people do it all the time. Recognize we have to focus on the value that's being delivered, because the value that's being delivered is the conversation that we have to ensure that we as measurement folks are providing value, or that the teams that are creating this data are providing value. 'Cause that's what's going to be important in post-COVID, right? Post-COVID, as we start to focus on expense reduction. I taught a class online the other day, and most of the people, the only people in the room, there were 3 or 4 people that had been in the workforce during the last significant economic shock. The rest of the people taking the class, and it was a Zoom room, so we're all virtual, so I couldn't validate that they were actually true, but everyone else in that 20-person group has never seen an economic downturn before. Their normal is what's been going on. And a lot of organizations, pardon my use of rough language, have gotten fat, dumb, and happy. And now have to start becoming more efficient and effective. As measurement folks, as if pug function point counters, we have a tool that allows us to have part of the conversation. It helps us get at that labor productivity. I'm suggesting that we need to go broadly, a little bit more broad, understand how that gets married, how those measures get married back to theory, right? It's empiricism and rationalism argument. Marry those two things together so that we can actually talk and prove value. A model that I've used over the years a couple of times that combines sort of an organizational and team level. So we want to empower teams, right? The team's empowerment, if I were to find anything in the Agile movement that should be fought tooth and nail over before it ever goes away, and there are a number of things that I think should be, but this, the idea of self-managed, empowered, self-organizing teams is really critical to getting high productivity, highly efficient teams. If you want another book and you're interested in reading books, I suggest you go and read Steve Tendon's book, Hyperproductive Knowledge Work Performance. It's also subtitled The Tame Flow Methodology, and this subtitle goes on for about 42 other words. It's like whoever the editor at the press decided to get every buzzword on the face of the earth in the subtitle. But the book really is about how Borland created high-performing teams and the methods that they use, combination of lean and what we would now recognize as agile methodology. So again, lots of different ways to do that, but one of the core processes and one of the core premises tenets is this whole idea of self-organizing, self-managing teams. But again, We have to live within the boundary of the organization. And in this model, one of the things that I like about it is that it talks about the fact that organizations have organization goals. They have organization goals for products, they have organization goals for improvements, those sorts of things that the bigger organization has to talk about, write down, know how to measure it. Then they have to let it be focus in, go down into micro targeting. Where can it be applied? And that spins it into that second loop, that team level loop, supported by coaching. And again, nothing happens without coaching very well. You can send people to a webinar, you can send people to a class. Most of us are sitting here wrapped, having a good time. Others of us are doing their emails, sort of thing. And so just educating, just talking about things doesn't necessarily mean that people learn things. So coaching is a mechanism to get that done. And then to frequently test against it. Because all of this, I think it might have been David Heron who once told me that it was a really bad idea to let a manager go to a conference by themselves, because they came back with all sorts of crazy ideas that were then implemented and then didn't work. And so whether it was actually him that told me that or someone at the same time, the reality is that just because something worked somewhere else, it may not work here. So we have to frequently test. We have to approach all of these changes as if they were an experiment. So they end up generating a change candidate. If you want other models, IDEAL is another model that I think is an excellent approach to talking through this. I like to see, circles within circles. I've been heavily influenced by Deming's popularization of the Shewhart cycle, PDCA, those sorts of things. Some people call that the Deming wheel. He always used to get very incensed when they did that, because Shewhart, before he died, was his friend and he thought it up, not Deming. So all of these things, we create filters and we leverage ideas from the team level, because we're going to empower the teams, but at the same time we have the organization create those boundaries that lets teams operate within those. A couple of reminders as we sort of sew this all up. One, I use the term continuous improvement in this presentation, in this talk, very much on purpose, because very frankly, improvement needs to be as close to constant as humanly possible. Most of us make changes in our organization or the organizations that we work with based on events. So those sort of event-driven kinds of things. Hopefully they truly are black swan events. Deming would have classified black swans, right, as special cause variation. Unfortunately, sometimes we take every variation, do a root cause analysis on it, and pretend that each one is special when it's a common cause. And the only thing that would address it would be a change to the overall process. Anything else would be tampering. But people tend to pile these things up and do them periodically. Scrum does a retrospective at the end of every sprint. Let's face it, the norm, at least norm here in the States, is that a sprint length is somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks, those sorts of things, tending toward 1 week. Albeit every once in a while you run into people who are doing 8-week sprints. Call that a middle distance race, in my estimation. But they wait and they pile these things up, and especially the longer ones, right? Or they do it at the end of a 90-day productivity increment or product increment and save. And they wait and they pile up changes. That's not continuous process improvement. That's not continuous improvement. That's periodic improvement. And very frankly, that makes all change significantly more risky. It also makes it harder to make lots of changes all at once because people have a day job. They have to be producing value. It goes back to the premise up front that we understand what our efficiency is, whether or not we're effective, and be able to have that conversation. If we stop and just do changes, that'll probably make us better in the future, but we're going to have an interesting conversation to get there. So, reminder one, process improvement is not the same as continuous improvement. So, a little bit of unsolicited advice before I solicit questions. One, stay healthy. This isn't a drill. Stay healthy. Do what's necessary to stay alive, take care of your family. But when you start to re-engage, drive for continuous improvement, because continuous improvement is going to send a message that we can be more effective, we can be more efficient. And at that message, that drive for continuous improvement, I think helps us stay employed. And staying employed. So, thoughts, questions? As I say on the podcast, thoughts, questions, all welcome. Please feel free to send your feedback. No, I'm kidding. Cool. Jon M Quigley, welcome back to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Tom, I so enjoy our get-togethers and discussions of various topics.
Well, my dog Nissa is saying that she enjoys it too, and she's trying to horn in on the conversation with an exasperated sort of barking about quality and the whole idea of quality. So can we talk about quality today?
Sure we can.
Before we get into application and whether or not it's different applying it to software than in product that's both software and hardware kind of combination, how do you define quality?
That's a tough one, isn't it? It can get really broad. Generally speaking, it's fit for use or purpose. And the product is able to do what is expected of it when it's expected of it.
So what if you have 5 different points of view, each have different expectations? Who wins?
And that's where you have to do those design trade-offs. And if you have customers involved, you have to have customers involved in those discussions to find out to what magnitude these things matter.
I have a pen sitting on my desk, and it's a Pilot G2. It's a gel pen. It's a pretty darn cool pen. There are all sorts of audiences from pens, from people who I worked with a woman last year that had probably a 50 or 60 high-end fountain pens because, she collected them. And she actually carried around a bunch of them. She liked her favorites and actually used them. There are people that have Mont Blancs. There are people that have, the 39-cent ones that you pick up in India, by the way, have really, really fine tips and are great. So how does one define quality in that market where the range of trade-offs can be so broad?
That's part of the customer expectation, right? If I'm somebody who's collecting pens, or likes that smooth writing of some of those high-end gel pens, then I'm probably not going to be out to purchase one of these 35-cent pens that you were talking about.
Albeit, I got to admit, the 35-cent pen I found in India, and if you can actually buy it, it is the Nataraja, Nataraj Classic Fine Point. It has the most fine point pen I've ever used in my life, and it is wicked. So it has, and probably fall apart because it is only 39 cents, but the writing and the fine point in it creates wonderfully, perfect legible wording. Whereas the G2 Pilot, which, I think I may have picked up at an office I was working on, is a nice pen probably costs 10 times as much, maybe. So it's still not expensive, but it's not a fine point pen and therefore not my favorite. So if we're going through design trade-offs in terms of quality, does that mean that quality is, if we're using fit for purpose, is that a definition of quality really mean that it's in the eye of the beholder?
Yeah, it's subjective, right? Exactly. You buy, I'll give you an example. I just turned in a rental car. It was a really nice rental car. Very quick, heated seats, all kinds of trimmings on this thing. Adaptive cruise control, side detection, and things like that. My guess is this car was a pretty expensive ride. I drive a Hyundai. That's the car I chose to purchase. I will drive that Hyundai until it no longer runs. Hyundai's got a very strong reputation for driveline. They're not especially high-end looking or high degree of finish, but that's not what I'm looking for in a car. I'm looking for something that's reliable and that the cost is reasonable, or the price that I pay is something that that I can actually part with. I won't cry so much when I'm losing that money. The difference between the two cars, the one that I just got through driving, I really enjoy driving that. And if somebody were to give me that, I would gladly give up my Hyundai. But to pay that kind of money for a car that depreciates so quickly, the mathematics doesn't work for me. Even with all those cooling features.
So is the definition different depending? Well, obviously it's depending on the product. So something to me, I actually have a Hyundai too, but it's an Ioniq, so it's a hybrid. It's got really high gas mileage. So to me, that's a big deal. But
yeah, mine's an Elantra and it gets 30 plus.
Okay, that's still
it's pretty good.
Pretty good. But I like tangible, physical books. I still like to touch them, albeit I think I don't read them as often as I used to. But I like that feel. So to me, a book quality is to have that tangible book feel with paper. I know I have friends that think that's absolutely mad. To them, it's next to worthless. They would rather have an audiobook instead. That to them, even though it's the same words, are quality. Same thing, different product, different definitions of quality. Well, it's not different definitions, but different perceptions. If we were to have fit for use as our definition, does that change by product?
It changes by product, and it likely or most certainly changes by customer who's doing the evaluation.
Does the definition or does the perception of quality differ?
I think as a general definition, the definition stays the same.
Okay.
The thing is, whoever reads that definition and you hand them whatever product, they're going to be telling you whether this is fit or not, based on what they see or how the product performs. So you can take this generic definition and work with the would-be customer or client to understand what their specific definitions with regard to this specific product or feature is. And that's one of the good things about the agile, quick iterations that are put out there for a customer to play with. And one of the downsides of a stage gate, because those gaps are usually very far apart.
Once upon a time, I heard Phil Crosby define quality as meeting requirements. So if especially in a project, if you did all of the requirements, you had achieved 100% quality.
I have two things to say. Number one is you really got around Crosby and Deming.
Yeah.
Wonder what other thing lurks beneath the surface. I am really impressed, or I'm glad to know somebody that knew those folks.
But you see the collision, right?
Yeah, the second thing I was going to say is that, I have to disagree. Mostly, I think Crosby, he knows his stuff, but I have to disagree with him on this. Conformance to requirements, not necessarily. Because there's so many things that are not documented or would be ridiculous to document. Let's say I'm an automotive developer, develop products for the automotive industry, and I get a set of requirements. But there's so many things that the product must not do that never show up in a requirements doc. Some things maybe, but not everything, that every non-expected behavior. So just because I can check the boxes that it does everything in this requirements doc, but by the way, it also does these strange things when they're when unexpected ambient environment things are, when it interacts in that environment, it can happen. Well, does that make it a good quality product?
No, at that point, is it? I would suggest that it's not fit for use at that point.
I would say the same thing, but it met the requirements, so I think he's wrong in this case. It's at least partly correct that it has to meet the requirements, but it has to do much more than that. In many cases, if you're talking about automotive industry or aerospace or aviation.
So why can't we know all of those? Why can't we and shouldn't we write all of those things down up front?
You can know some of them, but imagine a spec. Imagine the size of a spec that included everything that you wanted and as many of the things that you don't want. And some of those things are not knowable. You have to actually take the product and go explore. This is one of the reasons why there should be more than testing the product to requirements. We should be exploring the product beyond that, and usually with the testers to put the product in some weird situations and see what happens.
Yeah, I think we have to wrestle with the whole idea of exploratory testing some point in the future. I'm playing the devil's advocate here because I think you and I are exactly on the same page. Very frankly, you can build, and probably I may have built or worked on things that were built exactly to spec, and the answer was, "What? Did you build us?" So many of us have been there, especially with long-term programs, projects, whatever we want to have, and with StageGate, where you try to write all of that stuff down. And God forbid you should actually sign a contract that said everything was written down, because it never really did work well that way anyway. Not that we didn't do great things, it just wasn't an efficient way of doing the work.
Yeah, well, here's where I say my experience with StageGate is that not all the requirements were written, but a big chunk of them would be. And you would go through and produce some product that did something according to those requirements and learn something and then update the specs. So my experience with StageGate looks a little more like an agile approach, with the exception of the time horizon. Right?
So sort of longer term iterative.
Yeah, mainly due to the logistics around getting an embedded prototype built, right? A lot of times that would be the problem. So instead of 2 weeks or 1 week, it would be more like 3 weeks to 6. Not good, and then you run some tests on that product, learn something, and then go back and say, oh, you know what? We would never have thought this to be a requirement, but since you probably don't want this thing to smoke the wires should something short and maybe catch the vehicle on fire, I think we're going to add a requirement here that says there should be short circuit protection on this thing. And some of those things that we learn roll into future specs, so it's not altogether bad. Or it's not a single use for some of these things, some of the more catastrophic.
So a definition of quality being fit for use, I don't think that collides with any of the methods, frameworks, techniques that are in popular use today. Do you?
No, I don't. You just have to figure out what fit for use means specifically.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. I think that's probably... Yeah, I think perhaps next month we'll wrestle with fit for use and what that might mean. Jon, if people wanted to continue the conversation, how would they go about doing that?
I can be reached at jon.quigley@valuetransform.com. I'm on LinkedIn at Jon M Quigley and Twitter at Jon M Quigley.
You've got
And
this
I
Jon M
appreciate it.
Quigley thing just sort of covered, don't you?
You know what? There are other Johns spelt my way. Quigley's out there, so I kind of had to differentiate with the M. There are a couple of professors, Jon Quigley.
Interesting.
I found that kind of odd. I thought Jon was a fairly radical way of spelling my name. In fact, I used to joke that my parents didn't think I could handle a 4-letter name, so they gave me 3 letters.
Jon, as always, you brighten up the month when we wrestle with the alpha and omega of product development. Jon, thanks again for being on the podcast.
Tom, it's always a pleasure.
In Reread Saturday News, this week we tackle Chapter 2 in our reread of Tame Your Workflow by Steve Tendon and Daniel Doiron. Chapter 2 continues to explore mental models and focuses on how multitasking robs value from individuals, teams, and organizations. Remember, buy your copy, use the link in the show notes, support the blog and the podcast, and most especially the authors. The Software Process and Measurement Cast number 605 features our interview with Jody Kane. Jody and I discuss involving product owners in retrospectives. Jody suggests the answer should not be cut and dry. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?